Look, I know you're all here just to see the funny numbers go down, so I'll keep it brief explaining how I made this list. First of all, I play the game competitively, my viewer retention graph probably looks like this, and there's multiple different ways of doing that. There's the basic time trialing, 6v6 where whichever team scores the most combined points wins, and the solo queue system known as Lounge where you play for either yourself or a significantly smaller team. Each of these exist for both 150 and 200cc, so the average of those 6 categories, plus the added elements of music and visuals, all rated from 0 to 10, is that track's score. The gameplay categories are weighted double, and they'll be the tiebreaker in the event of a tie. So, although this is math-based, that math still came from my opinions, and that meant I had over 750 numbers to come up with. That being said, this video was extremely tedious to make, and your support for it would be greatly appreciated. With all that in mind, there's probably several tracks circling your mind as a potential number 96, and of all the tracks usually in that conversation, this one isn't in it nearly enough. The definition of a snooze fest in time trials, a miserable online experience, and some unforgivable graphical oversights, Alpine Pass is just straight up Alpine ass all around. I don't play N-word, that's simple. Apparently, Wave 4 made that not matter though, making for the first ever instance of a track becoming outward and becoming worse. That's genuinely impressive. If I were handpicking this list the normal way, this would have been my number 96. Getting hit once at basically any point of the race basically means your race is over, and tracks like that are just demoralizing to play. Don't even get me started on the godforsaken ramp skip either. The issue with a lot of tracks towards the bottom of this list is that one specific thing about them is god-awful. Perfect example here, DP3 is perfectly fine on 150, but god is it insufferable on 200 in every way possible. I fully respect Baby Park for what it is, and it accomplishes what it sets out to do flawlessly. However, unfortunately, that comes at the expense of how we choose to play the game. Nothing against you if you play the game casually and like this track for that. Fun fact, this track having one of the best songs in the entire game single-handedly saved it from being number 95, and if I were handpicking this list, that's exactly where it would be. The fact that there's damn near 100 tracks in this game, and yet Long Oval has become an entire nation's pride and joy is a spectacle humanity may never understand. Look, a game like this needs a Dry Dry Desert type track in the game to stay healthy and keep front-running balanced. Does that mean I like it? No, but it's a necessary evil, and that's why it's not dead last. That being said, some bagging tracks are better than others. I appreciate MC3 being significantly shorter than Desert, and while Shrooms are still busted, it's to a much more manageable extent. I think this is my first real hot take, but I never understood what people liked about Twisted Mansion. The ending is a breeding ground for uncontrollable chaos, and multiple parts of the track are just plain unsatisfying to drive, especially on Outward 200. Congratulations, Sky High Sunday fans, all 2 of you. Your oval is better than the other 2 ovals. If only that was enough to not make it still be bottom 10 in the game. Shout out to one of the most underrated songs on the soundtrack, though. The fact that Cheeseland can be successfully ran if the player is good enough at it brings a very welcome twist to it compared to other bagging tracks. However, fast driving on this track is insanely toxic, and the number of players capable of it can be counted on one hand, so it ultimately doesn't change much. Is this a skill issue pick? Maybe, but much like Twisted Mansion, there's so many spots on this track where your race can end just because the game feels like ending it. Maybe I'm just not good enough to manage the antics in the anti-grav section. There are 2 types of people in this community, those who run RMC and those who hate fun. This track would be significantly higher if the latter group didn't exist and force a Shocking Blue into every race of this track when it really doesn't need one. Being just straight up not fun or even unsatisfying to drive is a common theme with all these tracks at the bottom, and MKS is one of the worst offenders. That on top of the insane luck reliance on having Shrooms for Motion Glider, and having them in a high enough spot for it to even matter is just annoying. Nintendo's heart was in the right place when making Sky Garden, but unfortunately they took what we were cooking and boiled it in Flamin' Hot Mountain Dew. If we had just simply got these graphics over the DS version of the track, it could have potentially been one of the best in Wave 1. I have to give Yoshi Circuit credit where it's due, because the fact that this track is even functional in the first place is a miracle. Unfortunately, it's stuff like this, and especially stuff like this, that keep it from scoring any higher. I have been a long-time preacher that Wii Rainbow Road might be the single most overrated track in the entire Mario Kart series, and playing it in this game upon release to see a buggy mess was extremely validating. Hopefully it'll help people take the nostalgia glasses off in the near future. In 99% of cases, whether or not something optimal in this game is aesthetically pleasing has not mattered to me in the slightest, but the lap-free Shroom on 150cc London Loop is a gigantic exception. Like, just ew. This is the pinnacle of that unsatisfying driving point I keep coming back to, And spoiler alert, this is the only city track below a 5.5. Just goes to show how Nintendo absolutely killed it with these. There are two types of difficult tracks in this game. There's the fun kind, where strats are supposed to be hard and fails are generally your fault, and then there's this. Is consistency too much of a track factor to ask for? Okay, here's the first scorching hot take of the video. It's just that, as with Wii Rainbow Road, nothing happens on Waluigi Pinball until over 2 minutes into the race, and it feels like it drags online because of that. At least Maple Treeway, for example, is long, but set up in such a way that it can still make races interesting. We'll get to that later. The single most polarizing track in the entire game from a competitive standpoint. The fact that a very real number of races on this track are decided solely by the spot you start in makes it even more unhealthy for the meta than just a traditional bagger. Swamp Ruins is the dictionary definition of a nothing burger. It doesn't really benefit any spot, there's nothing much to the driving, it just kinda exists. If not for being the birthplace of Jesua Glider, everyone would constantly forget this track even existed. I very much appreciate that simply the world record combo makes Moonview Highway an absolute meme in the community. That being said, the very thing that made that happen is what makes the track so polarizing competitively, so it can only play so high. If there's one thing on my Mario Kart 9 wishlist, it's that either the opening track or the Mario circuit is fun online. I get that that's rare given the nature of circuit tracks, but they did it in 7, so it's far from impossible. Koopa Cape was so close to being good in this game. It was given all the makings to be the fun kind of challenging, and then it got scaled down to be fun-sized. Still far from the worst, but it's so disappointing that it didn't live up to its potential. We're now approaching some of the best baggers in the game, but again, they can only be so high on the list just because of their nature. Doesn't help Riverside's case that this exists. Big ups to the boys, though. This is a skill issue pick. I'm well aware of that. I just haven't been able to put the time into learning it yet, but I'm certain that once I do, it'll go up on this list. It had to be somewhere though, so for the time being, here it is. Just give it some time and this track will probably be higher. See, Nintendo? Putting a game-breaking shortcut at the beginning of a bagger does wonders for how much people like it. Oh, and, you know, giving it a top 3 song in the game, that helps as well. The former longest track in the game pre-Booster Course Pass, and surprise, surprise, it has the same issue as almost every new one. Worst part is, outside of tram bounce, the driving is just uninvolved and in a lot of cases, not fun. Makes the track really feel like it drags. Yoshi Valley is a really good example that less can be more, and in this case, the more that exists in this track is either completely useless, most of the extra paths, or actively makes the track worse. The ending circuit that just saves way too much time and is god-awful to do optimally in 200. I never understood the complaints about how Sunset Wilds looks. Is it perfect? No, the sunsetting would have been a nice touch, but the track already looks amazing as is, and like, look at these friends. How can you complain about this? That being said, it's still a traction track in a bagger, so I can only like it so much. Even after the DLC is done, there's still nothing in the game quite like Sherbet Land. I appreciate it being skill-based, and you can win it from any position, but the skill set it requires is notoriously annoying. Really a double-edged sword, and unfortunately I'm not on the right side of it. Skill issue, I guess. Is this high enough for you, Liam? For being a bagger, Toad Circuit does a lot right. From having actually involved driving at a high level to a shroom that, yes, is at the end and saves years, but is actually hard to do with one shroom. We need more skill-based shortcuts like this. One of the biggest cases in the game of a track being entirely different online and offline. One of the most powerful group runners in a 6v6 setting that is heavily respected by online players, but once you TT it, especially on 200, it turns into an inconsistent mess that feels awful to drive. I don't know what it is about Coconut Mall that drives me away from liking it. It's not like I'm bad at it or anything, and I know it's universally beloved, but driving it has always just felt off for some reason. I guess I just never understood the hype is all. One thing you'll notice in this area of the list is that a lot of tracks here would be significantly higher if one area wasn't anchoring them down. Wario's Gold Mine's a perfect example of this, because it's perfectly fine in most aspects, and then there's 150 time trials, where you're given the choice of self-induced coma or loss of feeling in your fingers. Real slim pickings here. It's very clear that a good number of tracks were only made with one of the two game modes in mind. The bias for DK Jungle was certainly leaning towards 150, because you play one race of it on 200 and it turns into the most booster course pass track in the entire base game, if you understand what I mean by that. Back to the point of tracks being just a couple mistakes away from being really good, there's no better example than Merry Mountain, where everything wrong with it is condensed into the very end. What the hell is this item set? Why was this half-pipe necessary? Why does the shortcut save this much time? And why is drifting down the hill this much faster than driving straight? Remember how I said there's two types of difficulty in this game? Well, PPS takes that concept as literally as possible, where 150 is absolutely loaded with driving tech and super fun strats, while 200 is, whatever this is. It got me a lot of views though, so who am I to complain? Cheap Chip Beach is an interesting case because it would generally be a pretty forgettable track that doesn't really play a role in the meta, but the people and teams that like it love it and keep it alive no matter what. To the rest of us, yeah, pretty mid. One of the single biggest instances of a one category anchor on this entire list. Unfortunately, when your track gets pace locked as often as the lightning section on Cloudtop Cruise does, it'll always be painful to TT. I am very grateful that a track like DK Summit is in this game. This is what all bottom spot tracks should strive to be like. The best kind of chaos is the one that is fully controllable and even avoidable if you know what you're doing. This is a perfect example of a track where online skill is prevalent despite TTing it being an absolute chore. We were on the absolute edge of perfection. This track was so close to being absolutely incredible, and then you get hit at the end of lap 3 by 5 items before you even realize what happened. I've always loved DS Mario Circuit, and it's still not bad at all here, but man, it had so much potential. If it weren't for Rainbow Road 64, this would be the most polarizing track in the game. I think I can speak for everybody when I say I love Wario Stadium when I'm starting it in first, and want to home XA from literally anywhere else. Also, the only reason this gets a higher music score than Pinball is because it was very clearly made with Wario Stadium in mind, and the port job is just kinda lazy. Mushroom Gorge was always my favorite Mario Kart Wii track growing up, and getting world record on it in day 1 of Wave 2 was a childhood dream come true. Then it got developed with Toxic Strats and I fell out of the top 10. Such is life, I guess. Ice Ice is one of the meta staples that I just never understood its popularity. The road is among the most uninspired in the whole series, and quite a bit of the track just doesn't work sometimes. Like, why is it so hard to get 2 tricks off the ending cut? Tight sections of tracks can work well if they're made correctly. Bangkok almost got this right. The concept of a top and bottom path connected by super narrow stairs actually works pretty well. And then there's whatever this is. I don't know, man, it just feels off. TikTok is extremely close to being much higher on this list. Its biggest issue isn't even the track itself's fault. The last turn might be the single laggiest in the entire game, and it's just an absolute mess, especially on lap 3. However, said turn is home to one of the best shortcuts in the entire game, so you have to take what you can get. Big Blue is the anomaly of this game. I know I've said that about a couple tracks, but trust me, this is the one. By far the most loyal fanbase of any track in the game, and like, just look at the top 10 on 200. The barrier of entry for being considered decent at this track when it's already not easy to learn is so absurdly high that it just turns me off from liking it anymore. Possibly the single biggest instance of a track being significantly better in team play than individual play. Peach Gardens in 200 Lounge is just a mess despite being one of the better 66 tracks. Making lap 3 go backwards was the right call, and this was a good track to do it for, but unfortunately this type of stuff always happens when there's a huge shroom cut at the end of a track. Speaking of tracks that desperately needed new life breathed into them, the new lap 2 on Calamari Desert was a much needed addition. Yeah, it's still a bagger at heart, but a significantly shorter track means power items are less prevalent, and the massive off-road patch is only there twice instead of 3 times. It's the little things. So, the cloud on Yoshi's Island. Concept, I love it. This is a super unique idea to make glider control, a skill that's almost never relevant, actually matter on what would otherwise be just a straight section. Execution though? The way it moves can make it range from either being directly in front of you to just annoying to get, or even impossible to reach on 150, and because of that, become a pace lock. I hope they try more stuff like this in the future, because if they get it right, it could be incredible.
Oh, look at Troy, he's on world record piece, he's gonna go to the stairs.
The obvious aside, I love what Water Park does for the meta. There's not another track in the game where Outward and Inward are this close to each other, and the only 2 other tracks even remotely like it are Peach Gardens, which is not a runner, and, yeah. Amsterdam is a perfect example of how a number of DLC tracks just straight up refuse to acknowledge that 200cc exists. It was built basically with only 150 in mind, and while it's not the end of the world, I do wish a couple parts, specifically the end of Section 3, weren't just artificial difficulty. I am biased. I know I'm biased. But I don't care. Moo Meadows was my first big break in the community. Climbing the 200 leaderboards as a track specialist and brand new player to the community were some of my fondest memories, and this track will always have a special place in my heart for those moments. Like Rosalina's Ice World, I don't exactly have all too much to base this rating off of. However, I'm making sure that this will be the next track I make a Learning Tracks TT video on, so stay tuned for that. This track seems super promising though, so I'm fine with giving it the benefit of the doubt. Remember how on Yoshi's Island I talk about how a pace lock can ruin an otherwise great track? Yeah, well, Bowser's Castle has 3. I'm pretty confident this track would be nearly top 10 if all the moving parts didn't impact the track as much, but it's still just fine despite them. Daisy Cruiser is just a textbook running track. No shroom cuts, satisfying driving that's not that hard to get the hang of, and while it does suffer from the same fate as Amsterdam where a couple of turns were just not meant to be played on 200, it's still a super solid track as a whole. I want to like this track so much more than I do. It is one single turn from being absolutely incredible, but that one turn is not only so bad that it brings the entire track down, but the only alternative is even harder? How do you manage that? Mario Kart 7 made the blueprint and laid the groundwork for a section track. Mount Wario perfected it in the next game. A couple parts of the track kinda feel out of place, but thankfully they're all confined to the first half of the track. Section 3 is one of the best parts of any Mario Kart track ever. Fun little life story I always like telling. One day in early 2021, I was getting bored in the middle of Animal Crossing attempts and started messing with my Mii. Among other changes, I switched its gender from male to female just because I was tired of the voice lines, but that had the secondary effect of referring to me with she/her pronouns in other Switch games. This is how my egg cracked. I would have spent more of this segment actually talking about this track, but it starts at the end of lap 3 online, so why should I talk about it any different? I know it wasn't because it was in the Wii U base game, but SGF just feels like it was meant for 200. The turns flow super nicely, the shortcuts just work, and then on 150 it just feels like it drags until you get to the impossible strat jump scare on an otherwise pretty easy track driving wise. Interesting design choice, but I guess it was never intended to be done shroomless, so whatever. We believe in varmint supremacy on this YouTube channel. If you do not accept varmint supremacy, we do not accept you. If you do not spread the word of varmint supremacy and send this message to 5 people in the next 24 hours, Brady will be coming for you. I'd save yourself if I were you.
Oh, look at Troy, he's on world record piece, he's gonna go to the stairs.
There is not a single instance on this entire list of one single track element ruining a track this much. Out of curiosity, I made my theoretical ratings for if the Berlin 200 stairs were functional, and found that they docked the track 2 full points and a spot in the top 10. You poor thing. One underrated element that not enough tracks get right is how much off-road a track should have. Too much is an obvious issue, none can be alright in some cases, but that's usually not the right move. You have to find the sweet spot. Sunshine Airport? It's there, but honestly it's not enough. This room has always just felt awkward and forced and out of place to me, I don't know. Also, if you ever feel worthless and forgotten in life, just remember this exists, and hang in there for the people who love you.
Oh, look at Troy, he's on world record piece, he's gonna go to the stairs.
Alright, at least you were a little closer this time, but why is this such a common theme on the city tracks? I really want to like Vancouver more. It's another track that's super close to being amazing, but this makes far too many instances of a stairs issue, especially on a traction track. Those are already inconsistent enough as is. I've always found Hyrule's place in the meta to be extremely funny. By all accounts, it really should not be a runner. One of the best shock spots in the game, a shroom cut to take first early, and a chaotic ending section where basically anything can go wrong, especially on 200 after how inconsistent the Nisk is on that mode, and yet, it's one of the most common and most powerful runners in the game. There's no questioning its effectiveness, but it's very ironic how it got to where it is. Man, I still get a little sad when thinking about Mute City. I was working so hard on a video about what was gonna be the first 1000-day record in the game, and then Wave 4 happened and invalidated multiple hours of script writing. Not gonna jinx it, but I think I'm gonna get another chance soon? Stay tuned to see if I just cursed it. If you're old enough to remember when it was a genuine strat to switch to babies and pick NBC in 266s, that's the Veterans Discount of 8 Deluxe. The fact that that was even a thing that existed just goes to show how polarizing the track was, but in a completely different way than something like Wario Stadium is. I value when a track brings something unique to the meta, if you couldn't tell by now. Jury is still out on Rome, but it earns an early high spot for not having a glaring flaw. Also, it took 6 waves, but Nintendo figured out how to make stairs! Finally! Actually, never mind what I said, it deserves a top spot just for that. Royal will always have a soft spot for me. It was one of the first tracks I learned the actual lines on when joining the community, and I've always loved driving it ever since. I wish that driving mattered a little more online, but the shock is a bit too broken here for that reality. Still a great track regardless. So why did the Singapore hype die off immediately after Wave 4 ended? It was the only track anyone could talk about for months, and then it just fell off the face of the earth. I feel bad for it, it did everything right as a track, and the game was more fun when it was a common pick. I want to make an effort to pick Dragon more online, but for whatever reason, whenever I play it, I just can't get what I want out of it. The Nisk is just so laggy, and on 150 that makes it near impossible to hit consistently, especially in a tight pack. Maybe I just suck, I don't know. There was a period of time in late 2020 and early 2021 where you could not go a single 200 Lounge event without a race to Super Bell Subway. Thankfully, those days are over, and the track is significantly easier to appreciate. Pair that with a few strats that actually make the track fun to TT, and you have one of the best glow-up stories in the entire game. I'm well aware I'm in the minority on this one, but I love playing DK Mountain on Night 1 of Wave 6. It was a super fun puzzle to figure out the driving on, and while some parts had a steep learning curve and were probably not objectively designed well, it's easy to grow an appreciation for once you get a grasp on it. For the first couple days of Wave 5, I was convinced Squeaky Clean Sprint's song was ripped straight out of 3D World. Trust me though, that is a good thing. This track took a few days to learn fully and get used to, but once I did, it became a joy to play. Still rough around the edges, but not enough to subtract from the experience. Shout out to the best track icon in the game, by the way. The single most underrated track in the game. The last time people cared about Choco Mountain was because your tires didn't get dirty on it, but now that that's fixed, it's a rare Wave 1 W graphically. It's also just inoffensively good. Doesn't stand out in any regard, but it doesn't have to. I like that about it. Paris is a base game track. I can't be convinced otherwise. It's just become so normalized in the meta and is so common in every method of play that it just feels like it's always been there. This is definitely a good thing though. Most popular tracks are either popular for good reason or popular by necessity. And then there's Excitebike. So what does make Maple Tree Waste this much better than all the other long tracks in the game? It's hard to describe, but it's just set up in such a way that makes races actually feel interesting the whole way through. From having an actual off-road shortcut to good spacing between the item sets, and there just being more things to do. Also, Fall is my favorite season by far, so I'm biased.
Oh, look at Troy, he's on world record piece, he's gonna go to the stairs.
Note to all other tracks in the game, if you're gonna have a god-awful, inconsistent strat in your track, make it the very first thing you do in the run, so you don't have to wait the entire track to inevitably fail it. Now, the City Sprint Stairs could have just not done this at all, but at least they took the second best option. Most tracks can't even say that much. I love you, Berlin, but you're the single worst offender. Sweet Sweet Canyon was already really good before the booster course pass, but the removal of glider target chocks made it incredible. What was once its biggest flaw, being overbagged when it really shouldn't have, became a non-factor and turned it into one of the very best online tracks full stop. Ending shortcuts still a bit spammy for my liking though. Probably the single biggest surprise on the list for me. I never realized just how much I actually liked LA, but now that I think about it, yeah. It's fun to drive, it's fun to coordinate team plays on, the shortcuts are well placed, it's just all around extremely solid and doesn't have a massive flaw. What if I told you there was one person in the community that single-handedly kept Grumble Volcano from being top 5? Okay, elephant in the room aside, this track does literally everything else to near perfection. From looking absolutely stunning to being one of the most underrated 66 tracks to being both fun and the right kind of difficult to drive online. Online. Madrid does one thing right that most other city tracks don't. Section 3 is the easy one. The worst part about learning the city tracks was having to slog through 2 sections of track you already know just to get a chance at the part you haven't gotten to practice. I very much appreciate that process being significantly easier here. Possibly the single biggest instance of a track being anchored by its graphics in the entire game. The fact that Tokyo Blur only just missed the top 10 despite a classic case of Wave 1 syndrome just speaks to how amazing this track plays, and it could have potentially even been top 5 if it came in a later wave. One of the most overhated tracks in the entire game. The best track in Wave 2, and if you've been keeping track, yes, that means at least one track from every single wave made the top 10. Just proves how good the Booster Course Pass was as a whole. I really appreciate how New York ramps up in difficulty as the track progresses, and the ending chaos on the last turn of Section 3 that I'm sure you've been caught in at least once is usually pretty avoidable if you know what you're doing. God, Wild Woods was just absolutely made for 200cc. I mean, of course it was in the 8U DLC, but I love how it's just generally more than meets the eye as far as the driving is concerned. From the ending shortcut with multiple layers to what the SNES Rainbow Road Nisk should have been. Also, if we're going off looks, this is number 1. This has to be a retro in the next game. I should not have to explain what makes this track so amazing in time trials. A good friend of mine already did that. That being said, I wish that translated to online a little more, specifically on 200, because the tight sections are just a little too luck dependent for my liking. The best track in Wave 5 and the best city track in the game. Is Athens perfectly polished? God no, but it's the fun kind of jank that you just can't help but like. That sort of bullshit kinda kept it away from being any higher, but 7th is still an absolutely deserved placement. At this point in the list, the issues I have with the tracks are absolutely minuscule. Like Rainbow Road 7, for example, I can't be the only one bothered by the edges of the roads being light blue. I feel like white would have looked immensely better. Also, it doesn't help that the Lap 1 Super Bounce is just annoyingly difficult with World Record Combo, and that aforementioned road is essentially wallpaper, shout out to Colton. Essentially perfect track if you can ignore those minor, and I mean minor flaws. Oh, god damn it. The best track in Wave 3, Blue Lake just does everything right as a running track. Involved driving that's super satisfying to do fast, these low trick ramps at the end are just genius, and on a completely unrelated note, why did they go so hard on the drums? I'm absolutely not complaining, just curious who made that decision, because I want to shake that person's hand. The best track in Wave 4, and take notes from yourself, Nintendo, because this is how you make a bottom spot track. Fully and entirely skill-based, one of the highest skill ceiling tracks in the game with the fun kind of driving tech, calm the fuck down, F, and a perfectly placed shortcut with perfect difficulty. God, it just does everything right. The best track in Wave 6, and I know it's early to be putting it at 3, but there's just no denying how incredible BC3 is on all fronts. There's nothing quite like this track in terms of driving, and I mean that in the absolute best way possible. The 10-year wait for another Visor's Castle was more than worth it, and as a wise man named Rookie once said, Nintendo, never make a Faithful SNES remake ever again. This is the best one of all time, and it's not close. If you know anything about me, you'd know Rainbow Road 8 would be number 1 if I were handpicking this list. I completely understand how that didn't happen though, and if the goddamn Fast Ladder were functional, it'd get a 10 to 200 TTs and be first with a 9.6 overall. Just a phenomenal track in every way, and just for the record, for all the people that love to say it's not Rainbow enough as a complaint, it's more Rainbow than 7. Just some food for thought. The best track in Wave 1, the best MK Tour Retro, and by my math, Ninja Highway is the best track in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. The perfect amount of difficulty, just an absolute blast to drive in both modes, and one thing I love about it is that how different of a track it is in 150 and 200. That's a really underrated feature that keeps tracks fresh, and none do it better than this. Again, is it perfect? No, I mean, if I lose one more run to this goddamn ceiling on lap 3, I'll lose my mind, but outside of that flaw, as with Athens, it's the fun kind of jank that you just have to appreciate. Home to some of the best shortcuts in the entire franchise, I love the aesthetic and it was executed near flawlessly. I could just go on, but you've already been listening to me waffle for long enough, so I'll let you go. Before you do though, remember that this video was insanely draining to put together. From all the ratings, to writing the script, to making all of those rating cards manually, the least you could do is like and subscribe. And please understand that it'll probably be a bit before my next scripted and heavily edited video because of this. I need a break badly. I really do love you all and appreciate your support, so I'll see you around. Thanks, guys.